The drop pods hissed as they embedded themselves into the damp, mossy soil of Varel 4, steam curling from the release valves and vanishing into the canopy overhead. From the Academy's orbiting vessel, 20 elite cadets had been ejected into separate sectors of the forest, each one selected from a different species known for survival excellence. For many of them, this was supposed to be a crowning moment, the final test before graduation from the Galactic Cadet Academy, a milestone that separated officers from foot soldiers, legends from mediocrity. But none of them had expected Varel 4 to feel so alive. The trees loomed high, not in a vertical uniformity like Earth's pines, but in a twisting, pulsing geometry that made Mia Carter narrow her eyes. Each trunk seemed to stretch and subtly shift, their bark glistening in the light, as though it were coated in sweat. The air was wet with the scent of rot and plant oils, and even the ground beneath her boots gave slightly, like walking across a stretched drum. She stepped out of her pod quietly, without a word, without activating the small emergency beacon located near the hatch. She knew better. In an exam like this, signals meant failure. Above her, bright flashes marked other drop pods descending through the foliage, some crashing awkwardly through branches, others guided by sleek repulsor stabilizers that cushioned the fall. She knew that most of her classmates had brought with them advanced biological enhancements, skin-reactive tools, adaptive optics, or species-specific survival glands. She had brought only her body, her mind, and what Earth's old forests had once taught her. It was not arrogance, it was instinct. She turned and crouched, touching the surface beneath her. It was spongy, a thick mat of decomposing plant matter and strange sinewy root systems. Already she felt the pull of microflora, trying to read her chemical composition. She stood, brushing the damp dirt from her palms, and began to move. Not far from her, in a neighboring quadrant, a tall, violet-skinned cadet named Varnick was vocalizing through subharmonic clicks, using echolocation to scan the terrain. His species, the krill, was famous for navigating void caverns on dead moons using only acoustic reflection. But in Varel 4, his clicks were swallowed by the absorbing texture of the leaves, which didn't echo at all. Frustrated, he clicked louder. The forest responded with silence. The krill cadet blinked in confusion, then froze as something rustled behind him. Something big. Mia, still walking, noted the sound from a distance but didn't alter her pace. She had already observed the rules of the test during briefing. No technology, no external assistance, no communication, and no escape for the next 24 hours. The goal was simple: survive in an unpredictable environment and construct a shelter that could withstand the ecosystem's nocturnal shift. But the instructors had been deliberately vague about what that meant. She paused at a clearing ringed by uneven rocks and half-fallen trees. She could tell by the scattered scratch marks that others had passed through this spot before, maybe even seconds earlier, but they had moved on, likely searching for higher ground or flatter terrain. She stayed. There was something about this place that felt like a natural buffer. The air was slightly cooler here, and the strange whines that echoed through the forest seemed to dampen as they approached this pocket. She dropped her small survival belt to the ground and began to scout the trees for climbable trunks. Meanwhile, deeper in the same forest zone, a blue-scaled cadet named Telge from the aquatic world of Kabur struggled to adapt his fluid-based thinking to the terrestrial chaos. He had immediately attempted to construct a shelter by pulling down broad leaves and fusing them with secretion gels from his palms. But the leaves refused to bond. He shouted in his native dialect and slapped at the bugs. The insects exploded into clouds of acidic vapor upon contact. His screams echoed. Somewhere else, another cadet called out for him, but the forest quickly swallowed the voice whole. Mia stood at the base of a tree that seemed healthy and solid enough to climb. It leaned just enough to provide good footing, and the branches above looked dense, ideal for support. She reached for a small vine and tugged it experimentally. It was sturdy. Using it, she pulled herself up, wrapping her legs around the bark, her boots finding small natural ridges. The tree smelled metallic, as if the sap carried iron or copper, and its surface was slick, but she didn't rush. One movement at a time, she scaled it until she reached a broad fork between limbs. There she could begin the foundation. She sat back and caught her breath, surveying the surrounding area from above. From this height, she could see movement, flashes of light from failed plasma ignitions, figures running from one spot to another with armfuls of green debris that wouldn't hold shape. Some were digging, some were pacing in circles, some were simply frozen. She watched as an insect the size of a small dog rose from a bush and sprayed a cadet with a sticky black foam. The cadet thrashed, unable to move. The drone hovered above for a moment, then recorded the incident before vanishing. The system was watching. Mia turned her attention back to her chosen tree. She had identified 3 other branches at the same elevation that formed a rough triangle. Perfect. She pulled out the only item in her survival belt, a carbon knife, legal by test standards. Using it, she began to slice long strips of bark from the inner limbs. These strips, once softened, could serve as cordage. She hummed softly as she worked, a habit she had developed on Earth while camping in the Appalachians. The sound seemed to calm her and, more importantly, didn't provoke the forest. Hours passed. The sun barely shifted, but the shadows changed in unsettling ways. Time here moved differently. Mia didn't look at the sky. She trusted her own rhythm. She heard voices calling, instructions shouted in panic, theories about magnetic shielding and local gravity pockets. Some cadets believed the trees themselves were alive and connected in a neural web. Others believed the test was psychological, pure simulation. But none of it mattered to her. All that mattered was staying off the ground and staying dry when the night came. From the other side of the forest, the loud, guttural sound of something breaking echoed through the trunks. It sounded like bones, huge ones. Another scream followed. Someone had encountered one of the native predators. Mia flinched, but didn't move from her perch. She had already chosen her spot. She would finish her platform before nightfall. Her mind, sharpened by years of hiking, building, fixing, and surviving without tech, had no room for panic. She had seen fear. She had fought through it. She would do it again. She tied the first branch into place using 2 bark cords, looping and twisting in a way she had practiced hundreds of times before. The platform was forming. Slowly, quietly. The tree swayed gently beneath her as a cool wind passed, and for a moment she felt weightless. But she was grounded in a different way, rooted not in the earth, but in confidence. Somewhere below, another cadet's shelter collapsed with a loud snap. Angry curses followed. Mia didn't even look down. She reached for another branch. There was still much to do. The light began to fade, not like it did on Earth, with a gentle descent into dusk, but in abrupt pulses. One moment the golden rays pierced through the foliage, dancing across leaves and branches. The next, shadows swallowed everything in long, irregular streaks. The forest canopy seemed to react to the dimming light, as if a living curtain was drawing itself across the sky. Mia paused in her work, sitting still on the high tree branch where her platform had taken shape. The shelter was not yet complete, but it was already strong enough to hold her weight and shield her from above. She had laid out a few large, palm-like leaves across the top, stitched together with braided cords of bark fiber. The structure swayed slightly, but it was solid. Below her, the forest shifted. It wasn't just the light, it was the atmosphere. The temperature dropped sharply, bringing with it a damp, musty chill that clung to skin and fabric. Mia reached for the fabric tucked inside her belt pouch, a square of thermal cloth woven with earth-landered insulation. She wrapped it around her shoulders, careful not to make sudden movements that might dislodge her balance. The air no longer smelled of plant oils. It smelled metallic, like wet iron mixed with something faintly sweet and nauseating. In the distance, a sharp, high-pitched scream cut through the forest. Not human, not any species she recognized. It came from deep in the western sector, echoing once, then stopping abruptly. The forest went silent again. Mia leaned forward slightly, steadying herself, eyes focused on the dark patches below where the underbrush rustled without wind. There was something moving down there. Something heavy. She could feel it through the vibrations of the trunk beneath her. A short, stocky alien cadet named Rallin was stumbling through the foliage nearby. He had chosen the lowland basin area for shelter, convinced the soft terrain would be easier for digging and nesting. His species, the Brontak, were tunnelers by instinct. But Varel 4 didn't care about instinct. The earth here wasn't soft soil. It was layered biomatter that moved when disturbed, and it didn't like to be dug into. Rallen had spent the afternoon trying to burrow a shallow pit for warmth, but now the ground itself seemed to reject him. He panted heavily, thick arms coated in dark mud, his eyes darting across the shadows. The hole he had dug had filled with a gelatinous substance that stuck to his skin and made breathing harder. Each breath now sounded like a strained hiss. As he turned, trying to retreat from the sinking bog he had created, his leg got caught in a vine-like root that pulsed when touched. It coiled around his ankle, squeezing tighter with every struggle. He fell backward with a grunt, slamming into the damp soil. His calls for help were swallowed by the forest's unnatural acoustics. Mia watched from above, not with cruelty but with grim awareness. She had tried calling out earlier in the day, just once, to check if anyone nearby was coordinating. The echo had come back distorted, carrying her own voice in reverse, as if mocking her. She understood then that sound here could not be trusted, so she kept quiet. Rallen thrashed below for several seconds more, before finally managing to slice the vine with his field blade. He didn't look up. He didn't know anyone was watching. Not far from him, a thin, multi-limbed cadet named Elisara from the Siricon species tried to create a floating shelter using pollen levitation, a technique native to her homeworld's light atmosphere. She had gathered large white blossoms and began triggering their air sacs, expecting them to lift a hammock-like structure she had woven between them. But Varel 4's gravity didn't cooperate. The sacs exploded instead, releasing a fine, glowing mist that clung to her exoskeleton. At first, she dismissed it as harmless. Then it began to itch. Then it began to burn. She screamed and flailed, her movements erratic and wild, the light from the mist creating a surreal halo around her agony. Mia looked away, knowing there was nothing to be done. The sun, or whatever passed for it here, flickered out completely. Darkness fell like a closing lid. Mia struck a small rock against another she had found wedged in the tree bark, creating a few dull sparks. It wasn't much, but she had prepared a small tinder nest from dry moss and bark scrapings. After a few more strikes, the ember caught. She leaned in, blowing carefully, coaxing the fire to life with steady hands. A faint orange glow bloomed from within the nest, and she transferred it to a simple bowl of coiled bark she had carved earlier. It didn't burn long, but it was enough to warm her hands and dispel the immediate chill. She placed the glowing bark inside a reflective leaf dome to conceal the light from predators. From the trees beyond, the sounds of movement increased. Mia could hear claws scraping across bark, wet pads pressing into moss, long tails swishing through foliage. Nothing came close yet, but she sensed the interest. The creatures of Varel 4 hunted by smell and vibration. Light would draw them, noise would excite them. Heat might attract the boldest. She sat still, heart steady, legs folded beneath her, arms crossed. Her breathing slowed until it became barely perceptible. Another scream echoed, this one a short, choking gasp. A large cadet named Dreb had built a lean-to structure from broad leaves and thorny stems earlier that afternoon. Now those stems had begun curling in the darkness, twisting into knots that constricted his shelter and pierced his back. He had thought the thorns were inert. He was wrong. His cry was followed by silence and then a long, dragging noise. Mia didn't look. To the east, another cadet activated his emergency beacon. A small red light pulsed in the darkness, rising slowly into the air as a retrieval drone descended. The drone scanned the area, extended its arms, and extracted the cadet without hesitation. One fail, one less voice in the darkness. Mia kept counting in her head, 18 remaining, perhaps less. Suddenly, from directly beneath her platform, a long series of rhythmic thuds echoed upward. She froze. Something large was circling the base of her tree. She couldn't see it, but the bark under her fingertips vibrated. The creature didn't growl or make noise. It just moved with confidence, stepping over roots, brushing against trunks. Then, for several minutes, everything stopped. The forest held its breath. A minute passed. Then 2. Then 10. She didn't move. She didn't dare. She had tucked her fire out. She had masked her scent with mud. She had chosen a tree with no visible trail, and she had broken no branches during her climb. She hoped it would be enough. The night deepened. The forest finally shifted again. Movement continued, but further away. The creature had moved on. Mia exhaled quietly, closing her eyes just for a moment, not to sleep, but to reset her thoughts. She needed energy for the coming hours. A soft rustling drew her attention to the canopy above. Tiny glowing insects emerged from hollow knots in the bark, floating gently around her shelter. They didn't sting or bite. They simply hovered, their glow warm and steady. She watched them for several minutes. One landed on her hand. She smiled slightly. For the first time since the pod drop, she survived the first wave, but the night was far from over, and she knew it would only get worse. The forest pulsed with quiet menace as the night reached its densest, heaviest silence. The air pressed down like a weighted blanket soaked in moisture. Every branch above Mia trembled with an invisible tension, and every breeze sounded like a whisper from a mouth just out of sight. Yet despite the darkness below and the strange glow above, she remained motionless on her perch, her mind methodically reviewing the next steps she needed to take. She hadn't yet secured the outer perimeter of her treehouse platform, and the roof still had gaps that could let in dew, or worse. But she had time. Instinct told her that the predators hunted those who moved, those who panicked and made decisions for the wrong reasons. She waited for the cold to become truly painful before beginning her work again. The temporary thermal wrap she had tied around her shoulders had absorbed most of the damp air, so she took it off and folded it, slipping it into the crook of the tree. She rubbed her arms briskly, then retrieved a handful of small branches she had carefully stacked earlier on a side bough. They were dry, ridged, and naturally curved, perfect for locking into one another. Mia crouched low, carefully balancing as she fitted two of them into a makeshift corner joint, then tied them with the remaining fiber cord she had braided during daylight. She worked slowly, with deliberate calm. Her thoughts were not cluttered with calculation or theoretical probabilities. She wasn't running simulations in her mind. She was listening to the movement of the wind, to the occasional cracks of distant twigs, and to the near imperceptible stretch of her cordage as she pulled it tight. The difference between instinct and intelligence had never felt clearer. Most of the other cadets had been trained in adaptive tactical response, using predictive algorithms, survival heuristics, and AI-augmented scenario planning. She had been trained by her grandfather in the backwoods of Oregon, where you didn't guess, you noticed. Where you didn't predict, you listened. Far below, another incident unfolded. A thin, tall cadet with semi-translucent skin named Uric had constructed a dome of pressed leaves and hardened sap in a clearing. It looked flawless, with perfect geometric symmetry, but it had no elevation, and now it served as a heat trap, drawing nocturnal scavengers curious about the scent of the polymer sap. Mia heard his muffled shouting, followed by a sharp yelp. His dome collapsed inward as something broke through the wall. Moments later, the unmistakable hum of a retrieval drone rose and faded into the canopy. She didn't flinch. She didn't look. Her task was not to win by outperforming others. It was to outlast the forest itself. She tied the final corner post into place, giving her a solid triangular roof frame. Then she pulled out two large leaves, shaped almost like stretched wings, and began stitching them across the top using small, bone-like thorns she had shaved earlier as needles. The task was slow, but precise. The thorns pierced the fibrous veins of the leaves without tearing. Once in place, the stitched leaf layer formed a water-resistant cover that curved naturally with the structure, forming a dome that channeled moisture off the edges. When she finished, she lowered herself into the center of her shelter and tested the flex by shifting her weight side to side. The whole structure rocked slightly, but held firm. It creaked once, then settled. She laid down flat on her back for the first time since arriving on Varel 4. Above her, small stars pierced the gaps in the canopy, though some of them blinked and moved, clearly not stars at all. She knew some of the forest life had evolved to mimic celestial patterns to lure prey. Even the sky couldn't be trusted here. She reached into the hollow beside her and pulled out a round fruit she had gathered earlier. It resembled an avocado, but with a spiraled skin. She had seen small rodents eat it without dying, which gave her enough confidence to attempt the same. She peeled back the spiral carefully, exposing the soft green interior. It smelled faintly of cucumber and iron. She took a small bite. It was bland, a little gritty but nourishing. She chewed slowly, mindful of conserving energy as much as calories. Her body needed something warm, but she wouldn't risk a full fire, not yet. As she ate, she thought about the difference in mindset that had led her here. Mia remembered the initial academy orientation, where alien cadets had arrived with retinues, pride, and ceremonial armor. Some had looked at her curiously, others dismissively. No one had imagined that a human girl from Earth could compete with minds bred for adaptation or bodies engineered for resilience. But she didn't come from the sterile Earth cities most galactic officials knew. She had grown up off-grid, climbing trees higher than towers, setting traps for raccoons, and repairing broken solar panels with duct tape and grit. Her training had not come from labs. It had come from scraped knees and trial by weather. Another sound reached her ears, this one closer. She sat up slowly, every joint quiet, eyes scanning the lower branches. A shadow moved on the forest floor, steady and slow. The creature was tall, with limbs that bent too many times, a narrow head that moved without sound, and feet that didn't leave footprints. It moved past her tree, paused and lifted its head. Its eyes, 6 of them, glowed with a soft amber light. Mia froze. She didn't breathe. The creature waited. Then it turned and moved on, uninterested. She lowered herself back down and let the tension drain slowly from her shoulders. It had smelled others. It wasn't hungry. Or maybe she had masked her presence well enough. Either way, she would not make assumptions. She pulled her cloak of leaves tighter around her and leaned her head back. A sudden cry of frustration broke through the night from a nearby quadrant. It was a cadet named Xerix, a thin furred creature with 4 arms and bright orange eyes. He had spent hours assembling a hovering shelter by redirecting magnetic pulses from the local minerals. He had constructed a levitating disc using only thought and code written on bark using his species' finger chalk. But now, something had interfered with the polarity. The shelter spun wildly before collapsing into a bright flash of discharged energy. Xerix screamed. Then silence. Another drone. Another extraction. Mia closed her eyes. She didn't celebrate her endurance. Every failure reminded her that this forest didn't care about intelligence or creativity. It only acknowledged those who listened, adapted, and respected it. She rolled onto her side, wrapping herself tighter in her cloth and leaves. The shelter now fully enclosed her on 3 sides, with only a small opening near her knees for airflow. Her elevated position gave her protection from ground threats. Her scent was masked, her fire was out, she had eaten, her tools were tucked safely within arm's reach, and she was still here, not just alive, but untouched. She let her mind drift, not into sleep, but into observation. She thought of her mother's voice reading old adventure books to her under candlelight. She remembered how her grandfather had said, "Your brain will save you, but only if your body knows when to wait." Those words had echoed in her all day. And now, in the belly of the alien dark, they wrapped around her like armor. The forest moaned once more, but this time, Mia didn't flinch. The first real scream didn't come until after the second pulse of darkness. Mia had already learned that Varel 4's night was not a single event, but a fluctuating cycle of shadow and pressure that passed like tides through the canopy. Each wave brought a new level of cold, a new level of weight in the air, and a shift in the sounds coming from the forest floor. The second wave hit harder than the first. Her body reacted instinctively, shoulders stiffening, breath shallow, heart slowing to match the silence around her. The scream came from the north, clear and full of panic. It didn't rise and fall with rhythm. It tore into the night like something ripping open. Mia sat up instantly. Her shelter held, but the sound vibrated through the bark beneath her. She kept her breathing even and listened. The scream continued for 3 long seconds, then stopped. She recognized the cadence. It was a male cadet, probably Gerun, a muscular cadet from the volcanic world of Drax. He had been confident, loud, and dismissive during pre-test simulations. He had mocked her lack of tools. Now he was either being pulled apart or extracted. A moment later, a bright white glow swept across the trees as a retrieval drone descended. She didn't move. The drone hovered briefly in the area of the scream, sent out a net of scanning pulses, then rose with something cradled in its arms. Whether it carried a body or a broken spirit, she couldn't know. But Garoon was out of the exam, another voice silenced. Mia shifted slightly and checked the tension of the bark cordage at the edges of her shelter. Everything held. The slight motion drew a response from below. A low growl, not loud, but deep and wet. It came from something crouched beneath the base of her tree. Not pacing like the earlier predator, this one waited. Patient. She didn't look down. She closed her eyes and exhaled through her nose. An hour passed. Her muscles ached. Her legs had begun to tremble from holding still in an awkward position. The growling stopped eventually, but she knew better than to assume the creature had left. It might be waiting for sound, or for the natural weakness of exhaustion to take hold. So she rotated slowly, resting her legs while keeping the rest of her body upright and alert. The night had turned against everyone still in the forest. She could feel it. Varel 4 wasn't simply hosting them, it was watching. To the southeast, a sudden flare of light burst into the trees, green and flickering. Someone had ignited a chemical torch. She blinked, then regretted even that movement. The light called things. The torch carrier was a cadet named Olinar, from the bright world orbit of Ismara. His people thrived in light-rich ecosystems and used bioluminescent flares to communicate. But this wasn't his world. The glow lit up the area around him, and for a moment she saw his figure racing between trees, the torch swinging wildly. Then something fast and enormous leapt from the shadows, too quick to register clearly. The flare dropped. The light flickered out. There was no scream this time. Only a deep thud and silence. The drone didn't come. She swallowed dry air, her mouth tasting like iron. Her hands had gone cold, even inside the shelter. The tension had crept from her muscles into her thoughts. She forced herself to breathe slower. Fear was not an option. She didn't need adrenaline, she needed clarity. From far above, the branches shifted. Not from wind, but weight. Something was climbing. Not near her tree, but not far either. The rustling was deliberate, the pauses rhythmic. She turned her head without moving her body. In the far corner of her vision, she caught sight of the source. A cadet was scrambling, up a tree with bare hands. She recognized his silhouette. It was Akron, a wide-eyed, green-skinned cadet from a high-gravity world. He had underestimated the forest. Now he was trying to imitate her, late and loud. He had no shelter, no elevation plan, only desperation. He reached a high branch, pulled himself up, and began to cry softly, unaware of how sound traveled in the upper canopy. Mia watched as two small, glowing figures began circling the trunk below him. They moved like cats, but their tails were rigid and their eyes were colorless. He didn't see them, but they saw him. She turned away, unable to watch what would follow. Then came the chain reaction. One scream led to another. From the west, someone shouted for help in a cracked dialect. From the south, a shelter caught fire from a heat crystal gone wrong. A cadet burst into flame and rolled into the underbrush, setting it alight. Varel 4's ecosystem responded by spraying down the fire with thick blue pollen that extinguished heat but coated everything in sticky slime. The cadet's body was pulled into the vines moments later. No retrieval, no flare. Gone. Mia knew the numbers were shrinking fast. She counted again. At the start there had been 20. By her tally, maybe 10 remained, probably fewer. She forced herself to focus. She pulled a small pouch from beneath the leaf layer, something she had woven earlier from overlapping bark strips. Inside, she had hidden 3 polished stones with metallic dust on their surface. They reflected just enough moonlight to work as signal flashes, but only up close. She arranged them in a triangle beside her elbow. If something reached her platform, she could knock them together to create a vibration, sharp, sudden, and loud. It wouldn't help her escape, but it could distract. A bluff. A final option. The rest of the night crawled forward like a wounded animal. Every breath was a decision. Every sound carried risk. No one spoke anymore. The forest had silenced even the bravest. A few hours before dawn, the growl returned beneath her tree. this time closer. She gripped the side of her shelter and leaned forward, slowly shifting her weight. Below, through a crack in the foliage, she saw it. Not clearly, but enough. A hulking creature, black-skinned with translucent patches of muscle that shimmered in moonlight. Its nostrils flared as it moved beneath her. 6 legs, no visible mouth, a split spine with a fin-like ridge that trembled with each step. It wasn't hunting, it was searching. She held her breath. It turned away eventually, brushing past a nearby trunk. The tree groaned under its weight. A low rumble passed through the ground, through the bark, through her bones. And then it left, just like that. She exhaled, eyes wide, fingers still clenched in place. She had made it. The worst of the night had passed, but the dawn had not yet come, and she didn't trust Virey to allow a sunrise without another test. The sky didn't brighten gradually, it fractured. A pale gray fissure opened between the trees, not like a sunrise, but like something ancient and heavy had finally lifted its hand off the canopy. The stars disappeared one by one, some fading naturally, others blinking out like artificial lights being shut off. The humidity didn't dissipate, but the air changed its character, from the clenched silence of hunting hours to something open, expectant. Mia opened her eyes not because she heard something, but because the pressure inside her chest finally released. She sat up slowly, peeling back the layered leaves of her shelter and blinking into the light. Her joints resisted her movement at first. Hours of stillness had hardened her muscles, and the cold had clung like a parasite. She stretched her neck, rolled her shoulders, and pressed her palms together until her knuckles cracked. The platform had held. Her shelter, though basic, had survived the worst. She examined the cordage. Nothing had snapped. No branches had sagged. The simple materials, selected not for innovation but for honesty, had outlasted the storm. She crawled to the edge and peered down through the leaves. The forest floor was visible now, a shifting landscape of ash-colored moss, broken branches, and dark smears that hadn't been there yesterday. Her tree remained untouched, but not all were so lucky. To her right, a few meters away, a shelter had collapsed into a heap of burned fiber and singed vine. Near it, a claw mark 4 meters long had been slashed into the soil. No body remained. No movement, just the remnants of panic, half covered in morning mist. A faint mechanical sound broke the quiet, a low, steady hum. She turned her head upward. Above the trees, gliding like shadows across the clouds, came the retrieval drones. They had changed formation. Instead of arriving individually in response to emergency beacons, they now flew in wide arcs, scanning, gathering. The exam was over. She remained where she was, unmoving, even as the first drone descended. It didn't come for her. It hovered above a nearby quadrant, extended its arms, and lowered a net to retrieve what looked like a pile of shredded fabric. It retracted the net without ceremony. Another loss. The drone turned and ascended. A second drone passed directly over her position, paused, then continued on. She began to count the number of drones that arrived and the number that left with cargo. She saw 2 more retrieve intact cadets, one limping and barely conscious, the other wrapped in emergency stasis gel. She recognized the second as Elisara, her exoskeleton now dulled and cracked. Mia watched her ascend with silent respect. She had survived, even if only barely. A new drone dropped lower and hovered beside her tree. This one was different. Sleek, black, and marked with the insignia of the Galactic Cadet Academy. An evaluation drone. It did not carry medical equipment. Instead, it projected a narrow beam of light upward that scanned the exterior of her shelter. She sat still, back straight, chin lifted. The drone rotated, scanned the base of her platform, the joints, the roofing structure, and then hovered in place for several seconds, as if processing something unexpected. The beam shifted and projected a pale blue circle beside her feet. A small screen appeared in the air, and on it, a single word in 4 languages. Pass. She exhaled and gave a single nod. The drone withdrew, disappearing back into the gray morning air. She stood then, rising fully for the first time. Her legs trembled, and the platform creaked slightly beneath her, but she held steady. She took one last look at the shelter, the knots she had tied, the shapes she had carved from memory, not manual. Then she bent and untied the central cord that held her roof in place. The leaves collapsed inward gently, like a blanket being folded. She gathered the bark pouch, the 3 polished stones, and her thermal cloth. Then she began to descend. The climb down took longer than the ascent. Every movement required patience, every foothold tested twice. Her hands ached from gripping raw wood, but she didn't rush. When she touched the forest floor, her boots sank slightly into the moss, but the weight beneath her felt earned. The forest no longer pressed against her with the same hostility. It remained alert, but no longer angry. As she walked forward, the path to the retrieval site emerged. Not a path in the usual sense, but a corridor where drones now hovered and cadets emerged, one by one, limping, bruised, but alive. She passed a cadet she didn't know, a male with dull gray skin and empty eyes. He didn't acknowledge her. She didn't expect him to. This place had taken something from everyone. For some, it would never be returned. The staging zone was a shallow basin surrounded by trees that had curled back their branches, as if bowing to the end of the trial. A single platform floated at the center, where academy instructors stood in silence, clipboards in hand, their expressions neutral. One by one, cadets were scanned, documented, and taken aboard. When it was her turn, she stepped onto the platform and stood still, as the scanner passed over her body. One of the instructors, a tall, red-scaled female with 3 eyes, tilted her head slightly and read something on her datapad. Human cadet, shelter, intact. No beacons, no injuries, no environmental breaches, no structural collapse, she said aloud. The male instructor leaned closer. Was she monitored throughout the cycle? Yes, the female replied. Minimal movement, no panic, no deviation from survival protocol. The male nodded. Noted. Mia didn't speak. She didn't ask what her score would be. She didn't care. She had passed something greater than numbers. She had endured. The platform lifted and glided toward the waiting shuttle. As she stepped inside, she caught sight of a reflection. Her face sunken from stress and hunger, her clothes damp and ragged, her eyes hollow but unbroken. She looked nothing like the cadets who had arrived in crisp uniforms and polished gear. She looked real. She took a seat and strapped in. The cabin remained quiet as more cadets entered. One by one, those who had survived gathered in silence. There was no celebration, no conversation, just the quiet presence of those who had seen the worst and made it to morning. As the shuttle rose from Varel 4 and the forest vanished beneath the clouds, Mia closed her eyes, not to rest, but to remember. Because someday, in a colder war or a deeper void, what she had learned here would matter more than any medal or title, and she would not forget.